like to welcome you to this event, which is centered around this book, which is called Saudi Arabian Foreign Policy, Conflict and Cooperation, which is edited, and much of it is authored by Neil Partrick, who is here to my right. Neil, by the way, is an independent writer and Middle East analyst, and all of you have the more extensive biographies of our speakers, and so if you want to know more about them, you can consult that. We'll be joined today also not only by Mr. Partrick, but also by Professor Mark Katz, who's professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and the latest addition to the roster of non-resident fellows here at the Institute. And we're delighted to have him joining us in that capacity. So thank you very much, Professor Katz. And running a couple of minutes late, but he'll be here in no time, and he will be sitting at the end of the table, is Fahad Nazer, who is another non-resident fellow here at the Institute and has a long history of analysis and commentary going back to his days as an analyst at the Saudi Embassy and going through his other positions that, again, you can read about in this little handout, which has all the basic information. Let me start by asking you to join me in putting your phone on vibrate or on off or in some other way incapacitating its ability to disrupt the event by bleating and ringing and whining and crying. So that would be great. Now, this book, Saudi Arabian Foreign Policy, Conflict and Cooperation, recently released by IB fills a yawning gap in the literature on the strategic equation in the Middle East in general and Saudi foreign policy in particular. It looks at Saudi policy from many different aspects, especially by separating the Saudi approach geographically. So it looks at the way Saudi Arabia has dealt with its relations with countries in different regions. So, I mean, there are sections in here on subjects as neglected but important as the Saudi relationship, not only with China, but with Japan, with India, with Latin America, things like that. It was invaluable, and I have learned an enormous amount from reading this book. So I think we can all of us who are interested in this topic, owe a big debt of gratitude to Mr. Partrick for putting it together and for authoring it, and it's just terrific. So we're very grateful to him on that. Obviously, the subject is particularly rich, given not just the importance of Saudi Arabia in the region and the impact that its foreign policy has, but also the dynamism currently within Saudi foreign policy making and the kind of evolution of Saudi foreign policy that we've been seeing over the past 2 or 3 years with the accession of a new king, with the change in the Saudi-American relationship, with the changes in the Saudi-Iranian relationship, et cetera. So you've got Saudi Arabia, in effect, emerging, or apparently emerging, as a new, much more proactive force in the region, no longer convinced that the United States is as reliable a partner and a regional leader and even a global leader as it used to be, and convinced perhaps that the country faces a myriad of challenges, internal and external, security and economic related, et cetera. So across the board, from many different angles, new set of challenges without even an ability to rely on the existing assumed set of assets, for example, the strategic relationship with the United States, which is not so much in question but redefined. So Saudi Arabia, as a consequence, has, I think it's clear, emerged as a much more autonomous, proactive, and dynamic player on the scene. And you can see this most dramatically probably in terms of the intervention that it's led in Yemen, but also initiatives that it has been leading with Egypt and others to form joint commands in the Arab League and in the GCC. Remains to be seen if that can happen, but they're trying. The new Islamic anti-terrorism alliance that they have put together, the joint exercise that was just conducted at a vast scale and expense more than 40 countries called Operation Northern Thunder, which involved all the GCC militaries plus Pakistan, Malaysia, Turkey, Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Sudan, etc. I mean, really a very extraordinary military event. Sending planes to Turkey, creating a new set of alliances with some unlikely partners like Sudan. Who would have thunk it? But there we are. A new relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, which again is responding to that condition. The large-scale execution recently of not only almost 50 al-Qaeda suspects, but also the Saudi Shiite dissident cleric Nimr al-Nimr, and then the subsequent breaking off of diplomatic and trade relations with Iran following the sacking of the Saudi embassy in Tehran. And then additionally, the cutting of aid to Lebanon and expelling Lebanese from Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries, and designating Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization and getting the Arab League to do the same. It was really extraordinary. And finally, the repeated threats, or however you want to put it, to introduce ground forces into Syria, usually framed in the context of a decision by the coalition. Yet there it is. All of that, I think, suggests a new Saudi approach to security, to the region, to the world. And so we're going to look at that today with the help of Mr. Partrick and the others. So I'll begin by asking each of them to address these issues in about 10, 15 minutes of their time. Then I'll ask them a couple of questions in my own capacity as moderator. I'll throw it open to you. If you can ask a brief question, don't give a speech. Just identify yourself, ask a question, and we'll get an answer. And we'll proceed in that way. So I'll begin by asking Mr. Partrick to lead the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hussein. I'd just initially give my thanks to the Arabian Gulf States Institute here in Washington, to Hussein for, if I may say so, his enthusiasm about the book, which is very, very touching and much appreciated, and also to Karen Young for initially setting up this meeting. I don't want to embarrass her. I'd also like to thank my wife, who's sitting here in the front row, whose name really should actually be on the cover of the book, quite conceivably as the de facto, let alone the co-editor. Her role in it was very significant indeed. She had to untangle many of my unintelligible sentences through what constitutes something like 2/3 of the book, nearly, that were written by me. And obviously there are other contributors too, including, of course, no less Mark Katz, sitting to our left. I want to start off by saying, and some of this will slightly go against what Hussein has already outlined.
Excellent.
In terms of phraseology such as dynamics and changed relationships, by talking about what I think are the basic premises, at least in terms behind my input into the book. And forgive me if some of this sounds almost trite and cliched. If it does, it's probably because it is. It doesn't mean it isn't any less something that's genuinely believed or largely believed in Saudi Arabia. I mean, primarily, and obviously I'm including in this phase of late period King Abdullah when the book began to be researched, going back 3 years ago now. The kingdom seen as itself primarily as vulnerable to a regional challenge from Iran, to its authority in many senses. I mean, you can talk about politico-religious authority, less in terms of economic authority, and vulnerable in ways which the Saudis would document going back a number of years, particularly since the Iranian Revolution, to challenges in spheres in the region that it feels it should have the preeminent role in. And also another factor of the late period King Abdullah, obviously tied very much to the Arab uprisings, was a sense of threat of almost paramount importance, slightly bizarrely to me, from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, as we speak now, during the period of King Salman's rule, and obviously the weight that his son Mohammed, as Hussein has mentioned, is exercising within that, the Muslim Brotherhood has been, in my view, returned to what was hitherto the traditional relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that was one where it could, to some extent, in common with other Gulf leaders, be accommodated, used, differentiated depending on particular context. But there was a time very recently when it was the Brotherhood and Iran seen as the comparable threats that the Saudis needed to mobilize against. The fact that that has changed when it comes to the Brotherhood, at least, and a return to the pragmatism that I just mentioned on that front, doesn't alter the general way in which the Saudis approach the region. I'm going to talk primarily today about the Saudis and the Middle East, and in that context bring in some international actors. I'm not going to attempt, as you might imagine, to try and summarize the entirety of the book in the next 10 minutes or less. So the means for facing these particular challenges has been fairly traditional. I think in many ways it remains quite traditional in terms of the way the Saudis see this. So proxy local forces who invariably would do the ground fighting in situations of actual conflict. Political allies, again, traditionally handled with some degree of pragmatism in Lebanon in a way which we've not seen very recently, but I think they'll probably go back to, who are hoped will do the Saudis' bidding, and sometimes these can be allies in conflict across the political spectrum, as was seen in a more peaceful situation, for example, in Yemen, as to some extent has been seen historically in the Palestinian context. Military assistance has been usually of the indirect kind, as opposed to the direct war-fighting kind, so it's obviously the Yemeni airstrikes that puts the so-called new Saudi foreign policy in a different light, as it were. But I would want to try and argue that in many senses, aspects even of that, the air campaign in Yemen, fits with their traditional way of doing business. And not forgetting, of course, the hope that US forces, or at the very least airstrikes, will be used, or at least encouraged, to, in a sense, do the Saudis' bidding in areas of conflict where traditionally it would normally not wish to intervene, and if possible, to incentivize ground troops, although obviously we are in a situation where the Saudis less and less believe that's likely to happen from the United States or allied forces. Examples of where this approach has been at work in recent years are obviously in terms of the financial and political incentivization of the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt, when again, the existential sense that the Saudis then had about the Brotherhood was a direct factor. The continued arming of a wide range of Syrian actors, political or rebel fighters, the attempts to build again, typical of Saudi foreign policy, a wide range of Iraqi allies since the downfall of the Saddam Hussein regime. Plausible allies, that is, allies that could be detached from any potential association with Iran or more obvious bedfellows in terms of Sunni Arab forces. An attempt to, very much in relation to the Arab uprising, solidify monarchical relations. Some of you, dare I say it, may remember the old King's Club, where briefly in the 1950s, attempts to draw closer to the difficult Hashemites, as it were, as the Saudis would see it, and others against the then Arab nationalist threat. So the more contemporary version was to join together in many cases with the inheritors of those old Arab nationalist regimes, who then came to be seen as more conservative men of uniform in the wider conflict against the Muslim Brotherhood. But so solidifying relations with monarchies, Jordan and Morocco in particular, became an aspect of aspirations regarding the GCC. Air power I mentioned, and in trying to encourage ground troops in some cases on the part of the Americans, the Saudis were obviously facilitating the use of drone strikes in Yemen before the Saudis then played that lead role in the air campaign. I'll say something very briefly about energy. The energy chapter was written by Neil Quilliam, who is an energy expert and runs the Middle East program at Chatham House in London. But on energy policy, again, many of us will remember or certainly be aware of how energy policy was used much more politically by the Saudis. Neil argues, and certainly it fits with my assumptions when this relates to other relationships, including the United States one, that energy is approached very pragmatically by the Saudis. It is primarily about market share. The attempt to squeeze out some North American shale producers, I think, has been a useful byproduct. They're concerned about demand from places like China and from elsewhere in the globe, and that is their preeminent motivation. Doesn't mean it doesn't get questioned, doesn't mean there are concerns, obviously, in terms of the domestic impact regarding revenue. But that's the way they see it. It's not something to be bargained with in terms of incentivizing American or other action. But a key thing to get in, and it's a thread through at least my chapters in the book, is that whether we're talking late period Abdullah or we're talking now under King Salman, the policy-making problem. Now, again, the caricature of the Salman administration, if I can call it that, and Mohammed bin Salman in particular, the defense minister, deputy crown prince, is to think of a kind of lashing out, a verbal lashing out in a sense, if we're thinking about Lebanon, a lashing out in terms of squeezing Shia populations in Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf, the lashing out in terms of air forces now for 12 months, in a sense, in Yemen, a policy which I understand was argued against in leading circles when the air campaign was begun. But there was quite a lot of impetuous action during the King Abdullah period. I mean, the fallouts with your own president, George Bush Jr., were a matter of public record over events in Israel-Palestine. The sudden announcement that the GCC was to be a union, the sudden announcement that as much as it was to go deep, it was to go wide and to extend to the Atlantic and incorporate Morocco as well as Jordan. These were quite ill-considered ideas that in some cases the foreign minister had no knowledge of. So an impetuousness, a lack of planning, a lack of coordination within leading policy circles is nothing new. Perhaps it's more dangerous if we're talking airstrikes in Yemen, but I think it was quite dangerous from a Saudi national security point of view to suddenly decide that Muslim Brotherhood were almost public enemy number one, and therefore weaken your influence in the context like Yemen, where Islah were and remain a leading force that has now been to some extent realigned with. So nothing new in a sense under the sun, and that problem of a lack of policy reflection remains to this day in Saudi Arabia. A former British ambassador to Riyadh, when I questioned whether there was a strategy in Saudi foreign policy, said to me, Neil, the strategy is quite obvious. They're seeking to contain and combat Iran's influence by a variety of proxy actors. Well, that sounds to me like a headline. Strategy surely has to have a sense of how you get to a target. It seems like an objective rather than a strategy. It seems to me you have to have a notion of well-thought means to get there, and alternative means to get there when your current means are not proving successful. And I think it's that is somewhat lacking, and in that sense, there's a continuum, consistency with the Abdullah period as well. I think I have about 4 minutes, if I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could go a little over if you wanted.
Oh, right.
Author's prerogative.
Thank you.
Certainly.
So in terms of where we are now, and talking now with some emphasis on the United States, appropriately enough, there's a sense that having, and this is how at least some close to the Saudi leadership and others will characterize it, a sense that the Saudis have gone against expectations, certainly against my expectation for what it's worth, and launched an air war in Yemen. This was not expected. So muscle flexing has gone on. There's been talk on the back of that, in some sense, of even ground troops. Again, Hussein mentioned this, in Syria. This is the Saudis semi-unbound from American and other British, for what it's worth, constraints, deciding to assert itself vis-a-vis Iran. Why are they doing that? Again, the caricature doesn't mean it's not believed to some extent in Riyadh, is because the United States has decided that the Iranians are at least as useful an ally as the Saudis have proven to be, and at the very least there should be an attempt at common working between those two countries. And from a Saudi perspective, that desire to accommodate Iran as a de facto presence and force in the region has seen soft pedaling on what were seen as fairly exacting standards initially on civil nuclear power and that program in particular. You could argue that there are concerns perhaps about the extent to which the missile program is not part of the deal and what is the actual reason for having longer range ballistic missiles. But I would argue that for all that, and for all the concern that gets publicly expressed by Saudi officials, they still cleave very strongly to the US relationship. It has many practical expressions. There is an intimate defense and advisory relationship. There's an intimate intelligence relationship. There's joint training and consultation very largely when it comes, for example, to Syrian rebel forces. The airstrikes for which the United States has such short notice in Yemen are also facilitated by American intelligence and, of course, American and British kit. So this is not a relationship, I would argue, necessarily in crisis, for all that the Saudis now realize, and I wonder if they really have believed it for many years, that the US is not the cavalry waiting over the hill to uphold the Al Saud leadership. And also, just add as a footnote, if we think of that air assault in Yemen as a kind of significant muscle flexing, an expression of at least autonomy by the Saudis, that itself was unusual, but ground troops were there very unsuccessfully, 2009-10, by the Saudis in Yemen. Saudi ground troops were sent into Bahrain in the mid-1990s, although, again, much presentation talks about 2011 as an expression of Saudi's interest to show its military weight in the region and reinforce allies where appropriate. And of course, if we think of that robust action in terms of airstrikes in Yemen as a groundbreaker, then we now have significant speculation around the possibility of attempted, I underline that word, attempted peace talks with the Houthi directly involving the Saudis, initially seemingly about exchanging prisoners, but I think from a Saudi national point of view, a relative desperation in terms of the financial and potential political costs of that conflict are driving them back to where they were before, where many people told me that before the Houthi took Sana'a, there was every possibility of wanting to get back to an accommodation with them as a potentially more reliable border security force willing to fight and die in contesting al-Qaeda and other elements. And again, I'm going to need, I think, to wrap up my comments here. I've overextended, but the encouragement of a cold peace, to use President Obama's phrase. The Saudis have been in this game for a long time themselves. I mean, if you think of the early Khatami period, the relatively late Khatami period, when it was quite evident to the Saudis that that president had no control over foreign policy, or indeed much of domestic policy, deals were struck. The Prince Knife deal in terms of internal security cooperation. A headline deal, maybe limited in terms of the depth of interconnectedness, but it was an attempt to draw closer. 2008, Abdullah al-Khamenei on the telephone trying to cool things down in Lebanon. Now, I know since then we've had an approach to Lebanon which has been quite surprising by the Saudis. They used to handle it very pragmatically, accepted there was a need for space for Hezbollah to operate, and since then, in recent times, they've taken a much tougher position. I suspect they'll row back from that at the risk of actually, in many senses, losing much more weight and creating the very thing that they fear has been happening in terms of a so-called Hezbollah takeover. I think there's also, and I'll wrap it up with just this final comment because I think it's relevant in many ways, and maybe I can come on to some of the pragmatics of some of their relationships, for example, with Egypt and Turkey and other countries in questions. There's also been, throughout my study, a sense that I've got of what I call Saudi doublethink. You know, the Egyptians are a hoped-for, at least under late period Abdullah, a hoped-for military ally, part of the so-called Arab military force. It's regretted that they're not doing more in Yemen. But then when you say to Saudis, so you want ground troops from Egypt in Yemen, just like Nasser had? No, I don't think so. The rhetoric, whenever it's expressed in terms of Egypt's interest in Arabian Gulf security, is as much scary to Saudi Arabia as it's welcome. There's a double think about the nuclear deal. In 2007, there was great fear that Saudi Arabia would be dragged into a possible preemptive strike by the United States or the Israelis against Iranian nuclear facilities. But at the same time, there was enormous fear when the United States announced that apparently in 2008 the Iranians were not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. There are inconsistencies. There are inconsistencies on a number of fronts. But doublethink is an ability to maintain two mutually contradictory thoughts in one's head at the same time without apparently realizing the differences between them. But I think I'll pick up the other points, if I may, in questions and leave it open to further discussion. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, at the Institute, to have contributed a chapter. My contribution, of course, is much more modest than Neil's. He wrote so many of the chapters, edited the book. I just basically contributed one chapter, the one on Russian-Saudi relations. And I have to confess right up front, there were two things that I did not anticipate. One, that Russia would intervene in Syria, and two, that Russia would announce it would withdraw from Syria. So events do have a way of taking things over. But I think there are certain things about the Saudi-Russian relationship that are kind of constants, and one of these has been that there has been an attempt on both parts, a recognition that they would benefit from an improved relationship, that both Saudi Arabia and Russia would benefit in this manner, but that this has proved quite elusive, and that's because there simply are a number of issues that have divided them. One has to do with petroleum, that for decades now, Riyadh has attempted to elicit Russian cooperation with OPEC in terms of restricting production in order to bolster oil prices. That what Saudi Arabia and OPEC don't want to do is to be the ones to cut back production, see oil prices rise, and then Russia be a free rider. Oh, you ever heard that phrase before, free rider? Anyway, for Russia to be a free rider on OPEC's efforts. And the Russians have basically refused to do this, that they have just not been willing to be limited. And what's interesting is, some of their argument is the reasoning is sort of hard to believe, that Putin and company actually argue that, well, you see, Russian petroleum firms are privately owned and the Russian government has no control over them whatsoever. They make their own independent decisions. Right. Another, of course, is that, you see, in the cold of Siberia, if we stop the equipment during the winter time, it will damage the equipment, and so we have to keep it running. This doesn't explain what they might be doing in the summer, but in any event, in other words, there's always a reason not to participate. Every now and then, they have been forced to cut back a little bit, or say they're doing so. We've recently seen an agreement between Saudi Arabia, Russia, Qatar, Venezuela to freeze production. But this reminds me of the first Soviet-American strategic arms limitation agreement, in which both sides agreed to freeze their current level of missiles that they had and were under construction. In other words, they didn't constrain themselves. Freezing production at such high levels doesn't exactly serve to constrain prices. Maybe it just prevents them from falling even lower. And so this is a constant irritant. In other words, that in the petroleum market, Saudi Arabia and Russia are competitors, and American shale production just exacerbates the whole issue. Another issue that has long divided them is Iran. Russia and Iran have long had a close relationship, although a difficult relationship, and that's a whole other subject that we could spend an hour on at least, talking about the difficulties in Russian-Iranian relationships. But they do cooperate. Obviously, the Russians helped the Iranians finally complete their nuclear reactor. They have in the past sold weapons. They have been supportive of Iran in many, many ways that the Saudis and the West have not appreciated. That I think that for the Saudis, what they have attempted to do is to impact Russian behavior. In other words, that one of the things that the Saudis have held out is that Saudi Arabia could buy large quantities of weapons, of all kinds of other things from Russia, if Russia would cut back on selling these things to Iran. And the Russian reaction is, we will sell you absolutely anything you would like, but we won't stop selling Iran anything. And for them, this is for them to be constrained by Saudi Arabia is just something that they don't want to do. And for the Russians, the idea, and I think the argument that they would make is that, well, actually, it would be very helpful to Saudi Arabia, the fact that we have close relations with Iran, because you see, we can help moderate Iranian behavior, you see. I don't think the Saudis have become convinced. The Russians have overlearned what they consider to be the lesson of 1967. In the June 67 war, Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with Israel, and then for decades afterwards, the American argument was that, well, the U.S. can talk to both Israel and the Arabs, whereas the Soviets cannot, and therefore it was the United States that ended up dealing with the peace process between the Israelis and the Arabs. Putin in particular has determined that he doesn't ever want to be in that position again, but that there are situations in which the shoe's on the other foot, that Moscow can talk with both sides, but America cannot, especially when it comes to Iran, and therefore it should work out that Russia should be in a better position. Now, of course, it hasn't quite worked out this way. Russia just isn't the United States, and the Saudis simply haven't been convinced. And so this is something that remains an irritant. In other words, for Russia, is that yes, they want to improve relations with Saudi Arabia, but not at the expense of doing any, changing their relationship with Iran. They're just not going to do it. And then another issue, of course, that we've seen that has been dividing them recently has been Syria. And here, I think we all know the story pretty well. That the Saudis see what would happen in Syria as a chance to get rid of an Iranian ally in the Assad regime. For the Russians, Syria, in many respects, has become a domestic issue inside of Russia. In other words, support for Putin does not want to be seen as ending support for an ally at the behest of the West or anyone else. He'd rather stick with the guy and to the bitter end to show strength in particular. That if he doesn't do so, that this leads to problems that he doesn't want to face in Russia. Maybe from our point of view, we don't see how he does this, but from his point of view, and also I think that as Russian analysts have told me in Moscow, is that Assad is the last Arab ally that Moscow has. If Moscow loses Assad, it doesn't just lose Syria, it loses any influence that it hoped to have in the Middle East, that Russia truly is a regional power that simply operates in the former Soviet space. So they are determined to dig in on this. And so I think, in other words, that these are things that have divided them. There's other issues as well. But I think one of the things that one also has to understand about how the Russians look at Saudi Arabia is that the Russians look at Saudi Arabia very much in the same way that the United States, at least before the Obama administration, has looked at Iran. In other words, that basically as a source of trouble. Moscow does not look upon Saudi Arabia as a conservative monarchy. Moscow looks upon Saudi Arabia as a revolutionary regime that is exporting jihadist ideology. I've had very senior Russians tell me this, that essentially Saudi Arabia, the parallel they draw is that Saudi Arabia operates like the Comintern used to operate. There was the Soviet government that dealt with other governments, and there was the Comintern that attempted to overthrow those self-same governments, and that Saudi Arabia is the same. There's a Saudi monarchy, the government that deals with other governments, and there's all these foundations attempting to overthrow said governments, and they believe that they're one of those, certainly the Russian position in their own Middle East is in danger, and that they really and truly see it in this way. Now, the difference, of course, between the U.S. and Russia is that if we fear someone, we tend to cut them off, sanctions, etc. When the Russians fear someone, and really fear someone, their reaction is to essentially make nice, if you will. to try to do business, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you might ask, well, then how does this explain that their treatment of Turkey at present? It's very simple. They don't fear Turkey. Therefore, they can afford to be nasty to Turkey. But Saudi Arabia, they try to be nice to, even though they really don't like them. And I think that one of the other things I think that one has to in thinking about the Saudi-Russian relationship, that they have another competition that's going on that I think that often people, I think here in Washington, we don't quite appreciate, and that is Saudi Arabia and Russia are in a competition essentially for influence here in Washington. Not so much that they can get things from either one from the United States, but for which narrative is going to prevail. Putin's narrative since 9/11 has been, you see, as he's often repeated, 15 of the 19 bombers were from Saudi Arabia. Russia, United States, we face the same enemy, the same Sunni jihadist enemy, and its heart is in Saudi Arabia. They are the common enemy, and you need to see it the way we do because we're basically on the same side. And I think for the Saudis, obviously, Russia is no longer the same concern as it was during the Soviet days, but clearly I think that the Saudis see Russia as cooperating with Iran, and Iran they do see as an existential threat. And for Russia to be doing this is not simply harmful to Gulf Arab interests, but to American interests. And then why are the Americans then playing nice with the Iranians? Why don't the Americans, why are the Russians doing this? In other words, that this is not, in other words, if you really want to be friends with Saudi Arabia, you're not going to be doing this with Iran. It's not good enough to say, oh, we can be friends with you both. And so I think that this is an important dynamic. It's different from the Cold War in a certain sense, just because during the Cold War, although the Soviet Union tried to have better relations, they had supported enemies all around Saudi Arabia, Marxist South Yemen, Marxist Ethiopia. There were the Nasserists in North Yemen in the 1960s. There was Afghanistan, etc. It was very difficult to believe that the Soviets really wanted to be their friend. But I think that now we have something very similar. With regard to Yemen, I think one of the things that, from the Russian point of view, that they're actually not unhappy that the Saudis are involved in Yemen, because the more they're involved in Yemen, the less they're involved in Syria. But they've also, I think, the Russians, they have not been terribly critical. That what they're trying to say to the Saudis is that, what you're doing in Yemen is maybe not that different from what we're doing in Syria. What you're doing in Bahrain is not that different from what we're doing in Syria. Preserving the existing authoritarian order. And that's sort of the narrative that Putin wants to put forward, that everyone benefits by the preservation of the existing authoritarian order. And why doesn't Saudi Arabia cooperate with that in places like Syria in particular? Anyway, I could go on, and I have gone on in the past about this, but I think that as time is getting short, it's probably best to turn the floor over to someone else.
Okay, Fahad, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hussein. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to participate at the events at the Institute here. And at the outset, I do want to apologize also for coming in late. Everything you hear about the metro is true, so that's on the record.
It is true.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed reading Neil's book. I think that it really does fill a gap in the literature. There are books available that do focus on Saudi foreign policy, but I think to a great extent some of them are dated. The focus is more on historical context. I think Neil's book does that to a great extent, but it really brings us up to the current day. He spoke about that at length today earlier. And so what you have is the focus is basically where we are now. Obviously, Saudi foreign policy has received a lot of coverage in the Western media over the past year or so, certainly since King Salman took the reins. I tend to differ a little bit. I have a slightly different take on things than Neil's presentation today in terms of whether this shift in Saudi foreign policy represents a fundamental and lasting shift, or is it something more transient? I think it's more fundamental. But that can also be traced to the last few months of King Abdullah's reign as well. This is not necessarily a question or a function of the new leadership, although that's a factor, but I think Saudi Arabia has been shifting or going in that direction for quite a while. I think that by many accounts, and certainly that's my reading, is that the events that came to be known as the Arab Spring in 2001, which in many ways did shift and upend the political order in the region, took Saudi Arabia by surprise, but they also took everybody else by surprise. And I think that what you've seen since is Saudi Arabia's attempt to adjust to these new realities, with the realization or the perception, certainly in Saudi Arabia, that the U.S. has abandoned its traditional policeman role in the region. For lack of a better word, I think that's fairly clear at this point. The chapters on U.S. relations and Iran are very interesting, thought-provoking. They're well researched, and obviously, when you think of Saudi foreign policy, you think, well, relations with the U.S., relations with Iran. But I think maybe the one takeaway or the main takeaway that I came away from reading the book was that there is more to Saudi foreign policy than making sure that relations with the U.S. are stable and that they're able to counteract what the Saudis call Iran's expansion and meddling in the region. Personally, I thought that the chapter on the Horn of Africa was one of the most interesting ones I've read in a while, because again, it's a region that you don't hear about. But it also, I think, reading, if you read only just that one chapter, it gives you a sense of just how difficult it is for Saudi Arabia to formulate its foreign policy, and again, that there is more to it than just the U.S. and Iran. A country like Sudan has been in the news lately. President Bashir has been going back and forth to Saudi Arabia quite a bit. But the book also highlights the fact that the Saudis have had concerns about food security going back to the 1970s, and this, in some ways, has figured in a major way in terms of cultivating relations with Sudan. It also delves into the difficult intersect between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Somalia. Again, I think that chapter, and among others, just gives you a sense that, well, the Saudis do face some difficult policy questions. There are treacherous waters around the region and more broadly, of course, but that it's not, it's not as easy as it's sometimes portrayed, that as long as they're in the good graces of the U.S. and that they're pushing back against Iran, that's all they worry about. I think that is obviously a major part of their foreign policy objectives, but there are other regions in the world that they're concerned about and that are equally just as difficult to navigate. And so as I mentioned earlier, I think just to respond to Neil's earlier presentation, perhaps a bit less optimistic about potential thaw in relations with Iran. I think one could argue that relations are at an all-time low. If one looks at Saudi media, whether social media or traditional media, Iran is hard to miss, and the coverage is overwhelmingly negative. For a long time, the emphasis was on on the nuclear program, what its true intents are, its support of various Shia militias. But now what you've seen over the past week or so, again in Saudi media, is the implication that Iran, in addition to supporting militant Shia groups, that's actually has a legacy of also having relations with Sunni militant groups, including Al-Qaeda. This has particularly been emphasized in light of the recent court decision here, which I believe was in New York, where a federal court has found Iran liable for supporting the 9/11 attacks. And that has really been kind of front and center in Saudi media over the past week or so. So I think relations are likely to remain strained for the foreseeable future. And I think at the core of that strain is Iran's almost unconditional support of Bashar al-Assad. I've talked about this more than I care to admit over the past 5 years, but Syria is, I think, in many ways, in the view of Saudi Arabia, is kind of an era-defining conflict that could potentially shape the trajectory of the region for years to come. And whether it's, in some ways, I think for the long term, I think the Saudis might even see its implications as long-term implications as more serious than even the war in Yemen. Yemen might be maybe a shorter-term concern, but Syria really, especially now with the involvement of not just Iran, but you have Russia, obviously, and various Shia militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, has really become, and of course, not to mention that a little group that's become known as ISIS also makes Syria its home. So it's a very combustible mixture, and Saudi Arabia, I think, resolving that conflict is probably at the top of its priorities. So given that this is taking place in Washington, obviously I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about U.S.-Saudi relations. I think there's been a growing disconnect, especially over the past few weeks. I think the article in The Atlantic probably didn't help matters. I've read more than a dozen articles in Saudi, just mainstream media, but there's hundreds of posts in social media, and the response has not been very complimentary, and I guess understandably so. I think there's some of it is disappointment to some extent, but I really think that it's important, though, and I need to make this point clear, I think that the Saudi-U.S. relations overall remain to be on solid footing. I think the Saudis still prefer to buy American goods. They obviously have a preference for U.S. weapons. Saudis by the thousands continue to come to the United States to study, for medical care, and for tourism. But there does appear to be a bit of a serious rift and a disconnect in the way that the Obama administration sees the Middle East and the way that Saudi Arabia sees it, specifically when it comes to Iran. One could argue that if you listen to President Obama's comments in The Atlantic and other interviews over the past few months, that he appears to think that reintegrating Iran into the international community appears to be the key to stabilizing the Middle East. On the other hand, it's very obvious that as far as the Saudis are concerned, Iran is the main source of instability in the region. So I'm not sure that disconnect will be bridged anytime soon. There's, given the proliferation of social media in Saudi Arabia and satellite television, there's a lot of focus on U.S. elections. People are, in Saudi Arabia, are certainly intrigued by Trump, and so is everybody else. I don't think his comments about Muslims and Islam have endeared him to Saudis, and understandably so. I think it's a little bit more difficult to gauge where Saudis stand vis-a-vis the presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, but I think, again, based on what I've seen, to most Saudis, she would be a much more preferable choice than Trump, who, in addition to making offensive comments to Muslims. And he's also taken a few shots at Saudi Arabia itself, in what seems to be, and at least partly motivated by this row that he has with Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. It's fascinating reading, that's for sure. But it seems that they'd be eager to kind of turn a new page with possibly another Clinton administration, but obviously I'm not going to make any predictions about the elections, not now or anytime soon. So, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for your really excellent presentations. And before I bring the audience in, I'm going to use my own prerogative as a moderator to just throw out a question to each of the panelists one by one. And I'm going to begin with the author-editor himself, Mr. Partrick, and begin by asking you to pick up where you sort of left off. I'm going to ask you actually two questions. Number one, I'd like to get your general reaction to the kind of gentle challenge that you got from Fahad about the the question of continuity, you made a very strong case, a very powerful case, pushing back against my own sort of the implications of my own introduction, which I really welcome, that there has been a lot of continuity, and you made a very strong case in Saudi foreign policy, and both in terms of attitudes and practices. I think you really gave a lot of good examples, but we've had pushback to your pushback, so I'd like to get your response to that. And also, you kind of left off saying that you thought Saudi Arabia, and something more specific and granular, just to go from the biggest picture, widest aperture, to something smaller. With regard to Lebanon, you said you thought that Saudi Arabia would make some move to offset the impact of the suspension of the $3 billion in French arms sales and the cut of $1 billion to the Lebanese security forces and other moves like Hezbollah and the Lebanese. What would that look like? What do you think Saudi Arabia is likely to do? What kind of thing could they do under the circumstances to preserve their influence in Lebanon and not simply give the store away to Iran in a moment of peak, even if they are and have traditionally been impetuous?
Right.
Okay.
Thanks very much indeed for those and for Fahad's comments as well. Perhaps if I logically would take the first one first and then perhaps use the Lebanese example.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually want to agree with something, or a central thrust actually of what Fahad said, when he said that he's not expecting or doesn't imagine there are high chances for any kind of significant Iranian-Saudi rapprochement. In saying that, the Saudis have been in the attempted cold peace game before, I didn't want to create the impression that I thought they'd be successful. I'm merely suggesting that they themselves, perhaps under pressure of the so-called Obama doctrine, but that doctrine's nothing new, in the sense it's been there for 8 years, has been foreshadowed in other ways, wanting the Saudis to do more to help themselves in military terms. Talks of new architecture, I mean, we even had this under Bill Clinton to some extent, and certainly around some think tanks over this side of the pond and my side. Doesn't mean it will be successful, though, and that's where I would definitely agree. I think the Saudis recognize that there's a wind blowing. Who knows what happens under a possible President Trump? I mean, he's actually said that he would end that nuclear deal, which to some extent, in theory, could be music to Saudi ears. But then again, as I say, there's that double thing. They're concerned about too soft a posture by Western states to Iran, but they're also concerned about what the implications are of a hard posture, and I use other historical examples of that in the book. So I don't expect anytime soon there's going to be successful rapprochement. What I do see is the continuity aspect in general, and this is also obviously what Hussein's picked up on. Now, I accept obviously that the impetuousness, as I characterized it, has had perhaps a more dangerous turn under what I see as largely a Mohammed bin Salman decision-making process, which is less consensual. But he's also shown a pragmatism. I mean, I assume that the interest in tribal brokered talks with the Houthi, for example, is something that Mohammed bin Salman would at least had some role in, perhaps in that particular case, because it's Yemen, Mohammed bin Naif and the tribal file, which used to belong to his father, would have some relevance as well. The war's not going well. There's American pressure there to do something about it, to some extent British pressure as well, embarrassment vis-a-vis the European Parliament about what British weapon was being used for. There's the whole issue of the social compact to some extent, which apparently Mohammed bin Salman is aware of because of low and likely continued oil prices. So the symbolism and the cost of that war is very difficult. It seems to me that Hadi is no more in power now, a year on, than he was when he set up government in exile in Riyadh. That's a huge problem. And so even, if I may put it like that, a figure like Mohammed bin Salman, who appears less of a cool head than his cousin Mohammed bin Naif, would recognize that. So I think impetuousness and a degree of pragmatism coexist, and I think that's the continuity. Now, to come down to the granular aspect, well, what about Lebanon, where there's a degree of shooting from the hip that's having a real impact on Lebanese throughout the Arabian Peninsula, if they happen to be Shia in particular. How would they row back from that? Well, I think for a long time there was Saudi concern about how potentially a total of $4 billion worth of arms money vis-a-vis the French would be used. I think it's one of the reasons why it took so long. I think about around April last year, the first tranche actually was delivered, as I understood it, to the Lebanese armed forces.
Yeah.
Not much reported on.
Right.
It took a long time for that to happen, partly because precisely the Saudis were so concerned about what they saw as Hezbollah penetration of the armed forces, so why launch the idea in the first places? And other concerns that the French and others had about the impact on the strategic situation on the ground. So that concern was always there. How they'll row back, I suspect, is on the more practical side. Emiratis, for example, have fluctuated with their pressure on Shia populations, particularly of Lebanese extraction in the Emirates. I can imagine the Saudis would fluctuate on that policy as well. It's clearly not a good idea. It's not good to the Lebanese economy. It's not useful for Saudi influence. So rather than announcing that policy is ended, I suspect they might start to row back from it in practice. But they also need to have their ambassador in the traditional way, who used to be open to everybody, to be open again to all kinds of talks, not least over the need for a new president in Lebanon as well. That might be an area where they would row back.
Right. Mark, well, let me come to Mark last and just say, ask Fahad to respond to that. I mean, what do you make of sort of that that response to you, and then we'll go back to Mark.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly didn't imply that Saudi Arabia has completely broken with its traditional approach to foreign policy, and its quite behind-the-scenes diplomacy. If anyone who follows Saudi Arabia closely realizes that King Salman has met with dozens of world leaders since becoming king back in January 2015. There's clearly they're keeping the channels of communications open. Certainly, we've been hearing a lot about negotiations with Yemen. This has been in the news recently, but also one could trace it back a few weeks, if not months. So they haven't abandoned that completely. On the other hand, if one looks at the history of Saudi foreign policy, I think one could argue that there's been a reticence and an aversion to using military force. I think that, to a large extent, has gone. I think if you listen to Saudi officials, certainly if you listen to Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Jaber, but if you read the Saudi media, I think there's still wide support for the campaign in Yemen. Yeah. There's still wide support for Saudi Arabia to do something to bring the bloodshed in Syria to an end, to help to actively oust Bashar al-Assad. That's very clear. And I think that much of this, and perhaps, I don't necessarily see this as an impetuous instinct among the Saudis. I think that, to a certain extent, the Saudis gave the Obama administration a chance in the aftermath, or as the events of the Arab Spring were unfolding. They gave him a chance to kind of respond, and especially certainly when Syria looked like it was quickly going to spiral out of control. And there were indications very, very early on that Assad was not going to entertain any kind of a negotiation, that he was going to brutally suppress the initially peaceful protests. So I think the Saudis gave the administration a chance to act and to maintain its traditional role until obviously the pivotal moment was the reversal on the attacking the Assad's forces after the chemical attack in the summer of 2013. Right. I've argued before, and I'll argue again, that I think that probably was the moment when Saudi Arabia realized that that it needs to readjust its expectations from the U.S. administration. And I think to a great extent, I believe that it's compelled it to play to adopt a more assertive foreign policy that we've seen obviously in most dramatic fashion in Yemen. But it's not. I don't think this shift has not happened. I don't think it's happened lightly or was not necessarily a reflexive reaction. I think they've given it some thought, and like I said, I think they've given the Obama administration a chance. But ultimately, I think they've looked around. The region is arguably the most tumultuous it's ever been, and certainly in recent history.
Yeah.
And they looked around and saw that there just was not much of an appetite coming from the international community, but from the U.S. specifically, to do anything to bring Syria, the bloodshed in Syria, to an end, or Yemen. I think maybe the case for Yemen was even more obvious. I think the Yemen, obviously, right on the border of Saudi Arabia, you had not one but two militant organizations, both of whom had crossed Saudi border
Yeah.
and attacked Saudi Arabia. And here I'm talking not just about the Houthis, but Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I think the Saudis looked around in Yemen and just saw it, unfortunately, slowly but surely spiraling towards yet another civil war. I'm not sure that there was any indication from the U.S. or the international community more widely that they were planning to do anything to bring some stability to Yemen. So in some ways, I think they were forced into this position. Perhaps initially they might have not been comfortable with it, but it seems that they are now. And I also, just to add one thing, I don't
Yeah.
think it's a coincidence that the campaign in Yemen is officially referred to as an Arab coalition.
Yeah.
And now you have an even broader coalition in this Islamic military coalition, both of which are Saudi-inspired and led. And so the Saudis are leading these military coalitions, which I think is fairly new.
Yeah, it is new. I mean, you do have this tension here in Washington between constant, very traditional demands that we've got to do more, to bear the burden for your own defense, and then not liking it when countries do that. So, in other words, there's a tension between burden-sharing imperatives and coordination and cooperation imperatives. They don't fit very well together, right? Let me ask Mark to explain something to me, if he can. I am struggling to understand the both policy and affect towards Russia when it comes to the Arab states and also even the Arab conversation. There's a great deal of anger and bitterness towards Iran for its role in Syria, for example, and a great deal of disappointment and even bitterness towards the Obama administration because of its policies or lack thereof towards Syria. And yet, when it comes to the decisive external factor in maintaining the Assad regime, underwriting it, arming it, supplying it, protecting it, nurturing it like a hothouse orchid, that would be Moscow and Vladimir Putin, you don't see anything of the kind. Instead, you seem to this kind of odd sort of courtship going on between the two sides. So I'm wondering if you can try to explain a little bit to me how you think the Russians perceive the Gulf states and the Arabs generally on this basis and vice versa, keeping in mind the extreme disconnect between the way in which others are held responsible for their behavior in Syria and Russia apparently is not.
That's a very good question. I'm not quite sure.
Maybe you can't explain it. I don't know.
It is difficult. Certainly, having gone to conferences in the Gulf in the past couple of years, one tends to hear the argument such as, well, if the U.S. is going to move toward Iran, we in the Gulf are going to move toward Russia. And to me, it always seems odd. In other words, if they're unhappy that the U.S. is moving a little bit toward Iran, so they want to then move towards someone who is a lot more close to Iran. It doesn't quite make sense. It's almost as if the argument is being made in the hope that that we'll sit up and take notice and not wanting us to do that terrible. For us not wanting them to move toward Russia, we will step in and then behave in the desired manner. I also have a feeling that part of it simply is due to the fact that there are great expectations of the United States.
Yeah.
There's simply expectations only of hostility from Iran. But Russia, I think they see is negotiable.
Right.
That Russia has no real principles that basically all it wants is money, recognition, and that it can be brought around, or I think there may even be the ambition that if the Gulf somehow improves relations with Russia, they can nudge it away from Iran, or even make the Iranians think that it's being nudged away, and help complicate that relationship. That in other words, there's no negative from trying to approach Russia. In other words, it might work, probably won't, but what's to lose? So we may as well give it a try.
How does this look from Moscow's point of view? I mean, you sit there in the Kremlin, you look at this kind of behavior in response to your own policies. How does that affect your calculation?
I think the way the Russians look at the world, look at other countries, what they always seem to convince themselves of is that those other countries need us more than we need them. Yeah. Therefore, they should make concessions to Russia, and that Russia doesn't have to make much. And they're frustrated because, the Saudis talk about buying arms, about buying railroads, about buying whatever, and they never do it. Well, damn it, why not? It's when are they going to fulfill their commitments? They talked this past summer about $10 billion worth of Saudi investment in Russia. Don't think that's forthcoming after the Russian intervention. Right. But the Russians really feel that because Russia is so important, that this is something that is owed. In other words, that people need to propitiate Russia. And why aren't the Gulf states seem to hold out the prospect that they're coming on board and understanding the logic of the situation, but they never seem to quite actually manage it, and this they find frustrating. And if the Gulf states think for a moment that Russia is going to change its behavior, at the behest of a lot of small states, this is insulting, from, I think, the Russian nationalist perspective. And that they feel that eventually the logic of the situation will lead to the Gulf Arabs investing, et cetera, and putting up with Russia not constraining its oil production, and that the logic of the situation will eventually lead to this. It just doesn't somehow ever seem to happen at the moment.
That was a fascinating reply. Thank you very much. So I think you can see what kind of intellectual firepower we've got here. So I'll throw this open. Let me just say, please identify yourself. I believe there's a microphone. Please identify yourself. And again, a question can be to a specific panelist or to the group in general. And we'll begin right here with this lady.
Hello, my name is Mana Alami. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I cover Salafi jihadi movements, specifically more in Lebanon. I'm interested in what you said about leaving a vacuum in front of Hezbollah. And what I think is a bit strange is that Saudi Arabia has a lot of tool in Lebanon. It networks with the Salafi scene. It hasn't interrupted the dialogue between Hezbollah and the future movement, or the cooperation between the intelligence service of the ISF or the army, which have been instrumental in cracking down on terrorist organization. We haven't seen that yet. Why is that? Is it a red line for the United States, or is Saudi Arabia not willing to go that far yet?
Terrific question. Would you like to begin?
Sure.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that, in a sense, links into what I was saying about the Saudis rowing back. This is a country they have a deep investment in. I mean, the pun is intended, as it were. Yeah. Creating a no-go zone, I mean, literally as well as politically and strategically, doesn't make sense to Saudi Arabia. So I mentioned the caution about the military sales, which have been prefigured for some time. And I mentioned the moves which have some history as well against the Shia population. But as you've rightly pointed out, there's many other levels of intimate relations between the Saudis and state and sub-state actors in Lebanon, and that has a long, long history. And the more diplomatic side of that has traditionally been the ambassador, as I mentioned, being one with, unlike a lot of Saudi ambassadors, considerable autonomy. They're all directly under the authority, obviously, of the king, but considerable authority, the current one and his predecessor, until fairly recently was information minister,
Right.
to engage actively with all key elements, including obviously Hezbollah and others. And my assumption would be that they would not wish to wind down some of those below level, below the horizon, below the radar, if you like, relationships, that they would only be cutting off their nose to spite their face if they actually started undermining as well. So I think that's a reinforcement in a way of the difference between the public steps that affect important people in terms of revenue by working in the Gulf and the kind of intimate connections that are always there as well. I wonder if
No, please.
Yeah, I mean, extend more widely to that,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
there was obviously always a contradiction there between the overlap between events in Lebanon and events in Syria, and the extent to which de facto Hezbollah has been quite useful as a container of ISIS and threatening a situation in Lebanon, threatening a stability which traditionally Saudi Arabia has very much valued, and as I mentioned, has interacted even with the Iranians until fairly recently to try and maintain. And I think there's an understanding from the Saudi side, and this has already been mentioned, that the preeminent importance of finding a resolution to Syria clearly does include, as they would see it, strategically dealing with the Assad regime. And that's obviously a fundamental problem in relations with Russia, for example, and the lack of enthusiasm for taking him on in terms of the United States. But there's also a recognition, and this was a key part of the research on the chapter that I did in the book, by a number of key elite officials. And I recognize a lot of the anger that there is about essentially the massacre of fellow Sunni Arabs by the Assad regime, but a real concern by influential foreign policy people, or at least voices that are out there, whether they're influential is perhaps another matter, that say, okay, we need to assist our key allies in the Syrian conflict as much as possible, but not so far, and indeed Prince Turkey, I think, has, shall we say, found this argument more persuasive as time has gone by, not so far that we destroy the state like in Iraq, as was done by Western actors, shall I say, that we actually need some kind of structure. We're not fans, obviously, of so-called federalism. It's been rather farcical in Iraq. We're not fans of the breakup of Syria. We need to encourage actors as far as we can in the Syrian conflict, but a broad range, not reckless ones, who actually undermine the whole structure.
Many commentators have suggested that, unlike Qatar and Turkey, Saudi Arabia has really been pulling back in its direct support for certain groups on the ground in Syria. Does everyone on the panel agree with that, or does anybody want to challenge that idea, by the way?
Well, I just would say on that, I mean, part of
You
that...
seem to agree with it, I don't know.
Well, no, I think there's been a degree of competition which affects, with the Qataris especially, which affects levels of support. But my understanding is that there's a number of groups, whether it's Jaish al-Fatah, for example, whether it's the so-called new Syrian army, which is being, I understand, co-trained as an active Salafi fighting force with the Americans. There's a number of support that still goes on. I mean, a former very senior, and he's quoted in the book actually, American official said to me that this appears contradictory. So we're involved in training groups that themselves may have links to the elements that we so want to encourage the Iraqi state forces and others to crush, or at least are indirectly connected, certainly in some cases have links with al-Nusra. We hoped, he said, that the kind of monitoring that was being conducted by the Jordanians, for example, whether it's through the coordination offices or whether it's through the so-called selection of appropriate groups to support, that there could be a wise use of money. But he effectively acknowledged that it was a wing and a prayer situation, that you would be training elements that might effectively on the battlefield be aligning against your enemies. A risky policy, and one, therefore, that actually the Saudis and others shouldn't be the only ones perhaps to be responsible for.
Good. Okay, we'll shift over here. Right now, it's gentleman with a hand over here, and then we'll shift to this side. We'll do you next, sir, and then you.
Thank you very much. Rashid Hamdan, Georgetown University. Just a very quick question.
Yeah.
What circumstances do you think need to exist on the ground in Yemen for Saudi to declare it a victory or go beyond a ceasefire and more towards a political solution?
Let's start with Fahad on that, if you would.
Well, I mean, I think that there's every indication that the Saudis do want this, the bloodshed in Yemen to end. I think there's a perception, perhaps in the West, but perhaps in the U.S. more than other places, that the Saudis either are not aware or simply don't care about the humanitarian toll that the violence has taken on the civilian population of Yemen. I don't think that's the case. They established a center almost specifically to address some of these humanitarian issues. I believe it's called the King Salman Center for Relief. I think it's also involved in providing aid to Syrian refugees, but I think the bulk of its work is going towards Yemen. That's one. A couple of weeks ago, the spokesperson for the Saudi military, General Asiri, actually spoke very frankly when he said that for the foreseeable future and for Yemen to make a successful transition, it will need the sustained help of its allies and friends in the region.
Yeah.
I think there's an awareness that this transition will not come by easily. But they've also said that ultimately that it is not Saudi Arabia's decision to bring this conflict to an end, that ultimately the forces that are doing the bulk of the fighting are Yemeni government forces, supporters of Hadi, and it's up to them and the Houthis and their allies to come to an agreement, and Saudi Arabia, I suppose in theory, will go along with it. What's interesting about Yemen, and you don't hear much about, is where Saleh and his allies figure in all this. I think certainly, I think in the view of many Saudis, he may be a bigger impediment to bringing this conflict to an end than the Houthis themselves. I think that there is the view among some Saudis that the Houthis could possibly be reasoned with, but that Saleh has proven himself to be ungrateful for the years and years of support that Saudi Arabia helped him govern his country to a great extent. But I think negotiations with him are probably non-starters. But I think, ultimately, I think they do want this campaign to come to an end. It's obviously gone for over a year at this point, and there's obviously been a lot of scrutiny in the West, in the media, and they're probably a little sensitive to that at this point.
Do you have anything to add to this, Neil?
Yes, I do.
I thought so.
I think one of the problems is the extent to which a state which in many senses didn't have the attributes of a state before the Houthi expansion cannot really marshal its forces to a negotiation with those who are challenging it. When we talk about pro-Hadi forces, for example, it's a very problematic term. One of the about turns that the Saudis have made is to embrace a key military figure they never really fully disconnected from, who was the right-hand man of Ali Abdullah Saleh, which is General Ali Mohsen, who has good links with Islamist fighters, including Brotherhood-aligned Islah and tribal forces, and that's part of success, relatively speaking, in Taiz, for example. But it's a region by region, it's almost a moment by moment, very temporary series of alliances that somebody like Ali Mohsen, for example, now being re-promoted by Saudi Arabia and others, can have. I understand he doesn't have much weight in terms of liberating Sana'a. So that would obviously be a key aspect to any discussion, it seems to me, from the idea of re-establishing the so-called legitimacy forces and the Houthi being disarmed, which was the initial war aim. There's now talk about the idea of obviously the Houthi being very much part of the discussion, as we're seeing, but a key part, without necessarily being fully disarmed, but a key part would have to be them somehow agreeing to give up a significant presence in Sana'a. But given that Hadi's forces don't have that either, and the key ally for Saudi Arabia at the moment, General Ali Mohsen, can't mobilize there either, it comes back to the obvious phrases of vacuum. If there is to be any kind of deal, then you have to ask who maintains it, who are the peacekeeping forces. Yeah. And again, this is why I have a problem with talk about new military coalitions and alignments. The idea, for example, of the coalition that's apparently at work in Yemen, called an Arab coalition, I understand it is very rudimentary in terms of what's being done on the ground. There's a very small number of Saudi nationals. There were more Emiratis. They've reduced their presence. They don't cooperate together. The others are providing symbolic support in terms of some airstrikes, and you have some fighters from Sudan and elsewhere, but not in large numbers. It's not a properly integrated military force. And many of the other projections about military cooperation are very often headline aspects. There's a huge gap between this enormous military exercise that's just taken place in Saudi Arabia and creating the kind of integrated military force that is actually talked about and the United States has actually been trying to encourage for some time. Again, a gap between headlines, between initiatives, between
And
statements,
reality,
and following through.
Right. Okay, we've got this gentleman right here, and we're going to do you and then you in the
Thank
back.
you.
and then
My
we'll
name
just-
is Javier Sancho,
Yeah.
former ambassador of Spain to the OIS and now principal at the Podesta Group here in
Welcome.
Washington. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, really interesting. And I have two very simple questions.
Sure.
The first one from Mr. Partrick.
Yeah.
Really looking forward to reading your book. I see a shift in Saudi foreign policy. There are clear signals. I mean, the fact that we have a professional foreign minister, for the first time not a member of the House of Saud. This is a clear message to the world that they want to do more, a more proactive at least, and professional diplomatic action. But even if it was a little bit prompted by a conversation over tea with the Pulitzer winner, the Saudi Arab Peace Initiative, for me, was a turning point. It caught us unawares. I was at that time very much involved in this, and in diplomatic circles, we were all in awe because it was coming from King Abdullah himself, and it was a peace initiative.
Yeah.
So my question is about the influence and how do you see Saudi role in the Palestinian
Okay,
Israel?
so that's the first question. The second question.
It's a very simple one about somebody mentioned the GCC and the fact that there was this idea of turning the GCC into something more like a union. And my question to Mr. Nazer is about the porosity of the borders.
Okay.
Traffic, illicit traffic.
Got it.
Thank you.
Okay. So Israel-Palestine for you,
Thank you.
porous borders and GCC unity for you, and we'll go boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, I think Abdullah, quite a long period before he died, certainly those who were close to his arguments and understanding told me, and it's a phrase I use in the book, felt burnt. One, by the launching of the peace initiative itself and the lack of response, as he saw it, not just from Israel, but the lack of determined focus on it by the United States and indeed by Western European powers as well. And in that sense, embarrassed, or you might even say humiliated, this is my language, from an initiative where you go out on a limb politically, albeit to some extent building on the Fahad plan, but offering a warmer vision of peace. And you're exposed in terms of what others who have to do, frankly, in practice, obviously having a lack of a diplomatic relationship with Israel, others who have to do the mediation or the diplomatic heavy lifting to make it even a possibility. He also felt burnt, as I understood it, by then the Makkah Accord, where there was an attempt to bring together the disputatious Palestinian parties, Fatah and Hamas, when, despite the incentive to be there, which, as I understood it, was largely financial, there was no political follow-through. And then we saw, of course, there was an attempt to bring down that administration, which in Gaza, which was then preemptively responded to by Hamas, and that brings us to where we are today. My strong sense from Saudis and wider Gulf nationals is that this was always there was always a gap between the personal engagement, which somebody like Abdullah particularly felt, and the anger he felt, and the view in the wider elite. And I think there was caution about too much engagement, for example, by a figure like Saud al-Faisal. And I think that brings me, if I may say so, sir, to your initial point about a professional foreign minister, that while it might appear to be a negative in a sense that you've got a senior member of the ruling family being a foreign minister, it's a great positive in the sense that it gives great weight to a role which is essentially in the hands of the foreign minister and nobody else. Right. If that's then in the hands of a commoner, I think Mr. Jubeir, highly professional and astute as he is, would in practice feel rather squeezed by more powerful figures in the royal family.
Fair enough. Fahad?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the borders, certainly Saudi Arabia has been concerned about both its northern and southern borders for quite some time. And the south, I mean, Yemen, during the best of times, has been, a conduit for weapons, drugs, alcohol, and obviously thousands of illegal migrants, and that's been a problem for many years. And the Saudis have spent I forget what the figures are, but hundreds of millions of dollars trying to secure that border, some very sophisticated fence to try to limit that. However, people still make it across, and the Saudi media covers that on a fairly regular basis in terms of the people going back and forth. Same thing in the northern border, where again you have Iraq, obviously, which is still incredibly unstable. The violence there continues, and again, it's in a similar situation to Yemen. You've had two militant groups operating out of Iraq, basically breaking the Saudi border from the north. You had ISIS conducted one such attack, I believe it was last year, where it infiltrated the border, crossed, and I believe killed a few security border guards.
That's right.
But there's also been at least one, if not a couple of rocket attacks from Shia militias that didn't hurt anybody. I don't believe there were any casualties, but there was at least one or two incidents, and there's certainly a number of, or at least a handful of Shia militias have made threats saying that we will attack, we will launch rockets across your border if you don't stop interfering in our affairs. So yeah, I think it remains a concern on both ends, but they've tried to reinforce both against spending hundreds of millions of dollars on fairly sophisticated equipment, but it's still a work in progress.
We're going to go with this gentleman right here in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Dean Reed. I have the public relations consultancy, International Public Affairs, called the TD and Reed Company. I have a comment and a question. First, I think it's been
Very brief comment, yeah.
First, I think it's been an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. We look forward to reading the book.
That's very
The,
welcome.
Comment is that there have been several references made to President Obama's interview in the magazine. And the conclusion that I think was overblown, that means that there is no longer a strong United States relationship or interest in the Middle East. I point out first that the United States government is not monolithic. You'll find that there are much stronger positions in the State Department, certainly the Defense Department, and the Department of Energy, and certainly in Congress.
Yeah.
This relates to, I think, had the question of Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, been addressed in the interview, you would have found quite a different conclusion.
And
But
points taken. What's the question? Do you have a question as well?
My question is, relates to this. I want to lay the preface first.
Sure.
My question, I was a bit surprised that there was little or no reference to Daesh in our entire conversation here today, which is the nexus of the United States relationship with the entire Arab world, particularly with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And that is the one, I think, the one area of great agreement that needs to be built on.
Yeah.
My question then is to you, Mr. Moderator. You mentioned initially that there was the new coalition being organized, led by Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
There's been very little recognition of that in this country, and the initial recognition was that it was perhaps ineffective and isn't going anywhere. Does anyone on the panel have any information to elaborate on where that coalition stands and what its prognosis is?
Very good question. We haven't heard much from Mark. Do you want to weigh in, or would you prefer to wait for another subject?
I'll just say something briefly. It seems like we are in an age in which, unlike the Cold War, when we had in the U.S. one overarching enemy, the Soviet Union, that nowadays we have kind of a choice of four, and people disagree. There's Russia, there's China, there's Sunni jihadists, there's Iran, and so what's the priority? And I think in the U.S. it's hard to define what the priority, but a lot of our allies don't have any trouble in defining the priority.
Right.
The trouble, of course, is that we have a lot of allies and they have different priorities.
Yeah.
And I think that for Saudi Arabia, priority number one is Iran, and that Daesh is down, in other words, further. In other words, they can deal with that later on, that Iran is much more threatening. Whereas I think perhaps for the Obama administration, just by their actions, Daesh is more important than Iran. Daesh is more threatening than Iran. And so we have, as is often the case in terms of alliance relationships, we have different conceptions of who is the more important, who is the more threatening opponent.
Mark and I have been in agreement strongly on that for a long time. Kind of brought us together. Quick comments on this from both of you, Ian and Neil, and then
Sure.
yes, by all means. And then we'll take a series of questions to wrap up. But go ahead.
I mean, my take on the interview was that the president was concerned that Daesh should not be dictating and over determining U.S. policy in the region or indeed internationally, that the threat, whilst serious, shouldn't be overstated. But I entirely agree with you, sir, in terms of there's a very active role that U.S. airstrikes and special forces have been playing in dealing or trying to deal with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And that's where obviously the coalition, so-called, comes in. The Saudis and the Emiratis were playing a lead role in it initially, to quite a few people's surprise, to a lot of shock on Saudi, Emirati and wider social media, and embarrassment, I think, about the very public display and publicization of the role of one or two leading figures within the ruling families in those countries in the airstrikes.
Right.
Yemen, and I think a degree of political embarrassment about the idea of bombing Sunni Arab brethren, affected that involvement. But the most recent statement, as we've heard, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, as part of the apparent muscle flexing by Saudi Arabia and its willingness to engage very actively in Yemen, was to say we'll put ground troops, as you know, in some scenarios into Syria, and certainly be part of a renewed air campaign, and they've sent some aircraft, again, as you know, so I'm sure, to Turkey. So it sounds like a renewed involvement, which was always very limited, was always very symbolic in that air campaign against ISIS. It's a long way away from what I see as Saudi Arabia's primary concern. I mean, there are concerns about border penetration, there's concern about ISIS in Yemen, there's concern obviously about ISIS in Iraq. But the primary Saudi concern, as you know, they argue it, they believe it, is that the source of ISIS's ability to expand in Syria is the Assad regime. But they are not proposing any forces to tackle that. And they're also very much emphasizing that whatever they do in Syria will be under the umbrella of the international coalition, which means US leadership. So again, on the one hand, we have a frustration and anger with the United States. We have a desire to go our own way and assert ourselves and to act against Iran when the United States apparently wants to appease it. On the other hand, any steps we do take are essentially coordinated with the US.
In almost all of your comments, there is this dichotomy between the stated position and policy, or between perception or intention and reality. It's very interesting.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I tried, or at least hope to emphasize during my remarks that Saudi-U.S. relations overall remain to be on solid footing. I didn't mention the cooperation against the campaign against ISIS. I should have. It's certainly kind of a bedrock of the relationship at this point. However, I do think that there's that disconnect is more between, at least from my readings, between the Saudi leadership and the Obama administration.
Right.
Obviously, we've seen and heard from different voices from the U.S. government, from Congress. So even the piece in the Atlantic makes it seem that members from the Obama administration, within the Obama administration, have a different take on Saudi-U.S. relations. But yeah, I think the disconnect is more about with the President Obama himself. And actually, I'm writing, or I just wrote a piece about that should be out tomorrow or the day after in Foreign Affairs, where I delve into that in quite a bit of detail. But overall, yeah, I mean, I think that Saudis at the official level and at large, I think remain to be very comfortable with Americans. I think they prefer to deal with Americans perhaps over, frankly, other Western countries. I think the lack of a colonial legacy for the United States in the Arab world has some role to play in that. But the relationship extends seven decades at this point.
Yeah.
So there's a familiarity, there's a level of comfort. When the deputy Crown Prince was here a few months ago, he essentially made a pitch to U.S. Companies that he wanted U.S. companies to invest in Saudi Arabia, and said that there's essentially $2 trillion worth of investment opportunities open. It was very clear that they preferred U.S. companies to come in and help in this push that he's spearheading in terms of restructuring the economic base of the country and lessening its dependence on oil. But also, even when King Salman came, he made it very clear that he wanted his first official visit to be to the United States.
Yep.
This is despite all the, the problems that they've had with the Obama administration.
No, that's very helpful. Okay, so we're going to take just a couple of questions together to wrap up. We've got 1, 2, and there's a third, I believe. Well, these two. That's it, and we'll take them together. So you, and then you, and that's it.
Hi, it's Perry Kamek with the Carnegie Endowment. I'm kind of particularly long been interested in the intersection and interaction between kind of Saudi internal politics, i.e. family politics, and its foreign policy. And it strikes me that as dramatic as Saudi, the change in foreign policy has been, even more dramatic has been the kind of consolidation of executive power. And in some ways, the temperament is really a kind of second order impact of this consolidation. So I just wonder if Neil in particular, if you could comment on that.
That's very good.
And then particularly just a quick follow-up, particularly the Yemen case to me is the most interesting aspect of that.
Yeah.
From my perspective, things are not going well, and I think have real bearings on kind of Mohammed bin
So
bin
Yemen is a
Salman's-
case study in that,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Okay, great. And then we'll take this question in the back here, and one more there, and then that'll be it. We'll take all three at the same time. So go ahead, sir.
Siggy Neubauer, I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Institute. I want to pull Europe into the conversation, especially in light of yesterday's attack. It seems to me that for all the criticism that has been leveled against the Obama administration's alleged role or alleged feelings against Saudi Arabia and so forth, sitting here in Washington, there's a broad understanding and sympathy for the Saudi regional position vis-a-vis Iran in particular. In Europe, not so much. And in Europe, you have seen the Swedish foreign minister going very publicly against Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and the Germans also.
The Germans.
Yeah.
And you see on the elite level a lot of criticism of Saudi Arabia. And now with the terrorist attack yesterday, my question to the panel is really, will this put additional pressure on the Saudi foreign policy? Could this be a turning point where Europe are saying, actually, the Saudi support for Wahhabi institution has contributed to this monster? And how is this going to impact, if at all or not, how Saudi Arabia moves forward, for instance, in Syria?
Terrific question. We got one more here. We'll take all three, and then we'll wrap up. One's right there. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Andegrini. I'm from Al-Mocha Coffee Company.
Yeah.
I'm
good.
curious, for a lasting solution in Yemen,
Uh-huh.
must we have economic growth?
Good question. Okay, so we've got the family dynamics and foreign policy, Saudi foreign policy, with a special eye to Yemen. We've got the less sympathy for Saudi Arabia and Europe and its impact on the Saudi-American relations and Saudi foreign policy. And we've got the question of economic growth and peace in Yemen. Why don't we begin with you? Want to address any or all of those? Go right ahead, and we'll just see what our panelists want to say about them.
Thanks very much. In terms of the decision-making processes which Perry referred to, there's no doubt that there's a formal and an informal side which has further centralized power in what was not from the beginning a institutionalized or highly consensual system. There was a consensus amongst a few key players. It's narrowed even further. Essentially, when it comes to many aspects of foreign and defense policy, it's a decision which Mohammed bin Salman has been leading. There was opposition, as I mentioned, to the Yemeni air war. It was effectively disregarded. It was very senior opposition. References in the book. There's the formal structure which he holds, apart from the Defense Ministry, which is the head of the Economic and Development Commission. And from that, there's formal authority over Aramco decision-making. There's no evidence that the decision on production levels, though, has necessarily been at odds with what many senior Aramco figures, including the still formal oil minister Ali Naimi, would take. But certainly there's a lot of formal weight and informal weight. Essentially, we have a system where politics and security is supposed to be in the hands of the Crown Prince and Interior Minister Mohammed bin Naif, but in reality, his authority is over internal security only. And economics is supposed to be, in terms of reform, challenges to the social contract, challenges to subsidization of domestic oil use and so on and so forth, is in the hands of Mohammed bin Salman. That's all true, but obviously enormous domestic weight more widely and over foreign and security policy, as mentioned.
Right.
It has having an impact on policy. It's certainly having an impact on Yemen. But I also mentioned signs of a rowing back from that Yemen policy because the evidence of its lack of success is showing Mohammed bin Salman perhaps to be more pragmatic on that than some would have expected. And a political solution to Yemen is clearly the only way in which there can be economic development. A country at war cannot
So it's
remotely
the other way
promote
around.
foreign investment, in my view. If I could just pick up very
Yeah,
quickly a point, I
absolutely.
mean, coming from Europe, where my own country is having a rather tortuous and closely fought referendum on whether we want to politically at least be part of Europe anymore, it's quite close to my heart. There is a degree, a very strong degree of elite and in popular level resentment. I would even put it as strong as hostility to Saudi Arabia. Quite a lot of that is based on ignorance. Doesn't mean it's wholly untrue, but there are some wild distortions, even including, if I may say so, from some senior officials. It's not confined to Europe. I mean, President Obama, in terms of the concern, I didn't mean this in terms of ignorance, but the concern about so-called Wahhabi funding was expressed by himself very clearly in terms of where the funding streams go to in Europe and elsewhere. My sense over many years, especially the early to mid-2000s in Saudi Arabia, was that elite figures there, and there's leaked State Department documents to this effect, took it very seriously themselves. But there was a disconnect between formal policing, as in ending donations in mosques, and the sub-state level of donations, sometimes by errant princes, that would find their way into networks more widely. But because you're funding, if you like, a kind of semi-official, sometimes blind eye approach, sometimes not monitored at all, a degree of cultural outreach of a kind which would be teaching things which obviously Western liberals would find quite appalling, doesn't necessarily prove prima facie that there's a direct connection to terrorism. And I think that's the difference, which I have a problem with in some of the accusations that are made about so-called Saudi Wahhabi extremist funding. The ideas may be appalling in many respects, but it doesn't necessarily neatly, directly feed through into a responsibility in any sense for terrorism.
Excellent. Let's see if Fahad's response. And then we'll
Sure.
conclude
I mean,
with,
the first question in terms of the restructuring of the government institutions, I think the move itself surprised people because it was done so quickly and so dramatically. But while some might see it as consolidation of power, and certainly that's there's some merit to that argument. Others have looked at it as a streamlining of institutions. One of the major changes was that the Economic and Development Council is one that is headed by the Deputy Crown Prince, and the other major body that was created is the Political Council. Those essentially two councils replaced 12 different advisory bodies. If one reads, Saudi media, social media, I think there was a lot of support for that move because there's a perception among many Saudis that there's too much routine, too much red tape in the government, that things need to be streamlined. And one gets a sense that part of the push towards streamlining the performance of government institutions and putting an emphasis on accountability and performance is coming from Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And to be honest, I mean, considering the fact that the overwhelming majority of Saudis are under 30, I think there's support, there's some excitement about the move towards a younger generation of professionals that His Excellency the Ambassador mentioned earlier. And you see that in a number of governmental positions, including at some of the embassies around the world. There is wide support for that. And I think in many respects, you even see it with some of the proposed economic reforms that are on the table now. While they're not uncontroversial, but there are many people who view them as a long time coming, that these were moves that had to be that have been discussed for many years, but that it's about time that they've actually been implemented in terms of widening the economic base and just lessening the dependence of the economy on oil revenues. In terms of Sig's question on the support of people called Wahhabi institutions. I think it's very clear that Saudi officials are very frustrated with the with that perception. And you see it in opinion pieces, you see it every time they're asked about it, and they point to the fact that since 9/11, or certainly since 2003, when there were a series of terrorist attacks inside Saudi Arabia, Saudi policymakers took a very hard look at what was being taught at their schools and what was being propagated at some of their religious institutions inside Saudi Arabia and abroad. I think hundreds of imams have been either retrained or dismissed from their positions. Same goes for teachers. The curriculum, the educational curriculum, has gone some comprehensive reforms, although it remains to be a work in progress. And I've written about this recently. As you see, ISIS expand its influence in the Middle East, and unfortunately, you see more and more terrorist attacks in Europe. Obviously, people are desperately trying to find an explanation of why is it that we have this phenomenon. And Wahhabism seems like an easy answer, but I've argued that if there's a correlation between the rise of ISIS and the terrorist attacks that we're seeing now, it has very little to do with some rediscovery of Wahhabi texts that go back to the 17th century, and it has a lot more to do with the war in Syria. I think it's no accident that the so-called capital of ISIS is in Raqqa in Syria. That's where it was formed. That's where the overwhelming majority of foreign fighters are not going to Iraq. They're not going to Syria. That's well documented. I don't think that's an accident. I think that Assad's brutality furnished ISIS with a perfect way to recruit fighters. I think, and unfortunately, it has been able to construct a jihadi narrative that has resonated with many militants around the world.
Okay, thanks. And Mark, you can take your pick between
Very
all
good.
of
Well,
those.
just the question on Europe. Neil obviously knows far more about this than I do, but this past year I had the opportunity to visit Berlin, Paris, and London. And what I found in these places was that for the most part, people have a very dim view of Russian policy toward Ukraine, Russian policy towards Syria. On the other hand, I found a lot more stated sympathy that you find, more than you find here, for the idea that really the Assad regime is in fact much less worse than the alternative.
Yeah.
And maybe, and the fact that the Saudis continue to support the opposition is in fact keeping this war going, keeping the refugee crisis going, and that in fact maybe, if we could just essentially, in other words, the Russian logic on Syria, if not Ukraine, is actually, they buy into it. That being said, what I found in Paris in particular was that the American push for the nuclear agreement with Iran and Gulf unhappiness with it is seen by the French as an opportunity to gain sales and influence in the Arab Gulf countries, that they really see this as an opportunity. And hence, they were far more negative about the agreement, and it was done specifically for improving their relations with the Gulf Arabs.
Terrific. Well, ladies and gentlemen, go out and get it today. Saudi Arabian Foreign Policy, Conflict and Cooperation, edited by Neil Partrick. Please join me in thanking Mr. Partrick and our other guests.